Thank you and speak to this august body this evening. As the father of three young children, this is past my bedtime. If at any kind of point I seem to be kind of floundering, throw something at me or come and give me a wee kick. Um, so enclosure happened, or so the popular understanding goes. Somewhere between the 12th century, when increasing income for the lords encouraged investment in making land exclusively theirs, England and the late 19th century, England was enclosed. The open fields consolidated and made private, the commons and waste fenced off, divided and brought into a useful state, and the feudal obligations, manorial laws, and common rights of the old system made obsolete as feudalism gave way to capitalism. And what little opposition supposedly there was came to naught because, in the words of the first systematic scholar of enclosure, Edwin Gonner, writing in 1912, there was little opposition because it deserved little. This supposed quietude, the greatest testimony to the advantages of enclosure. Now, this story is well known, it's repeated the world over. Indeed, it has become, in some ways, one of English social and economic history's greatest hits, if I can use that phrase. But it represents, in many ways, a narrowing of a more complex story. And indeed, this overview, this enclosure story, has perhaps kind of been narrowed further by work in the late 20th century, so really from the 1960s kind of onwards, offering a more kind of critical take on enclosure. So, for instance, the great E.P. Thompson observed that enclosure was a plain enough case of class robbery, a line that kind of echoed Karl Marx's assertion that enclosure had a history written in letters of blood and fire. Now, this is, I'm going to argue this evening, a simplification of a much more complex story that rides roughshod over a range of experiences, geographies, and times. Now, none of this is to say, and I should make this kind of be very clear at this point, that what I'm trying to do is kind of overturn what is a very, very, very strong case. The overall story, the overall history of enclosure is quite a simple one. It is quite a simple case of the rights in common in land were alienated. They did become kind of exclusive. They were kind of rendered into the more or less kind of stable and alienable kind of law in private property. And this did involve some dislocations, yes, of course. The common rights, not least of the poor commoners, were kind of, in many cases, taken away by the wealthy that already kind of landed in their acts of enclosure. And indeed, many of the large-scale acts of enclosure in the 16th and 17th century were quite simple kind of cases of one class, the landed class, imposing their will, their desires, their capital against the relatively poor. Now, we know a great deal more about kind of opposition to enclosure, both in the early modern period and the modern period. And indeed, we increasingly kind of understand that wherever we dig into the archive, we can find some opposition to enclosure. So Gonner's kind of line that it provoked little kind of opposition because it deserved none is kind of now kind of evidently seen to be kind of untrue. So we need a little bit of context to try and better kind of understand this story and to think about how we might try to complicate it. So from an English nationwide kind of perspective, the early kind of years of the 18th century, so from about 1709, with some earlier examples, not least in the county of Gloucestershire, there was parliamentary support to enclose through the passing of dedicated local private kind of acts. And after kind of 1800, and particularly from kind of from the general kind of acts of enclosure of 1836 and 1840, it became easier and easier and cheaper to gain kind of parliamentary support to enact an enclosure in your parish or on your manor. And by 1760, about 75% of England was enclosed. Now, you might think, given that we have these kind of wonderful kind of parliamentary acts with very precise figures as to kind of acreages of land and maps to show where this kind of land was enclosed, there is still a great deal of dissension about precisely how much land was enclosed by parliamentary kind of act, let alone how much land was enclosed by forms of agreement outside of kind of parliamentary acts. There is some degree of, if not quite consensus, but there's some stabilizing of thought somewhere around the fact that about 20% of kind of land was kind of enclosed by act, and another 5% of the English land mass enclosed by agreement. Let's say individuals, coming together and agreeing outside of the need of a parliamentary act to enclose after 1700. Now, this is kind of complicated somewhat by the fact that some English counties were supposedly long since enclosed. Now, my native county of Kent is supposedly one of those. Other places at the margin, so places like kind of Cornwall and Essex, also have very, very kind of high levels of kind of early enclosure. Somewhere like Kent is kind of interesting because it never actually developed the open field system that dominated so much of so many English kind of agriculture and so many of the English counties, including large parts of Gloucester. Places like kind of Kent and Essex, the old Roman system of kind of land holding actually kind of persisted. This story is kind of complicated further still by the fact that today, in the early 21st century, there are still some 400,000 hectares or thereabouts of land which remains kind of unenclosed, registered common land. Small amounts of this are kind of plots of land which have been given the current legal status of common land, and that were never kind of originally kind of areas of common land, but it's a very, very small fraction. So large kind of areas of kind of England still are commonable. Largely kind of upland areas, but but parts of Gloucestershire, of course, too, including kind of Cranham, the picture I used on the opening slide. So some local context. Now, when I kind of tantalised you with the prospect of thinking about the English West, I'm really going to focus on the counties of Gloucestershire and Somerset. I think going any kind of further kind of west than Somerset, really, it's kind of there'd be dragons. So I think focusing on these two counties is probably enough. Now, for Gloucestershire, we know from extrapolations of Ogilvy's Britannia, which is essentially the first English road atlas, if you like, from 1675, that about 37% of Gloucestershire was still open in the final decades of the 17th century, and so it was considered to be largely open. In neighbouring Somerset, slightly less, 21% kind of open. I suspect that might be a slight exaggeration, and a figure as well heavily skewed by the presence of the large kind of at the time unenclosed Royal Forest of Exmoor, by the unenclosed Somerset Levels, and the Mendip Hills, large unenclosed as well. So Somerset's a strange one, largely enclosed but large areas of kind of largely enclosed but large areas of unenclosed land. Rudge, in his general view of the agricultural account of Gloucester in 1807, claims that there were about 10,000 acres of waste in Gloucester at that point in time. a figure which really doesn't make a great deal of sense unless you take the Forest of Dean out of the equation. For Somerset, we have, according to kind of Leonard Baker in his recent University of Bristol PhD thesis, about 24,000 of acres being enclosed on the Mendip Hills, 22,000 acres of land being disafforested and enclosed in Exmoor by 1830. So that by that point in time, about 13.8% of Somerset had been enclosed by an Act of Parliament, and a very, very high amount of 12% of land being enclosed by local agreements. No one has undertaken such a systematic analysis of enclosure by agreement in Gloucestershire yet, at least not that I'm aware of, but I suspect that figure will be much, much lower than 12% for Gloucester. You can predict as well for Somerset, where a lot of the enclosures were after kind of 1794. So down on the levels, up on the borders with Bristol, and on the Mendip Hills, places like Priddy and Charterhouse. So that's a brief kind of overview of where we are. This story can be massively complicated if we start to look at what happens on the margin. And by margins, I'm in no way trying to kind of to denigrate a great county like kind of Gloucester, the county of my father's birth, by saying that it is a marginal county. It is obviously not. It's clearly kind of the centre of the known universe. Somerset somewhat less. But I mean marginal kind of land, places on the margin, things like roadside edges, small remnant commons, remnant kind of forests, plots of kind of land that aren't written into this big picture of the enclosure story and its grand narrative about the enclosure of open field agriculture, of common pastures and large wastes and commons. So I'm trying to kind of move away from this story of enclosure being something which was enacted by the rich, and as kind of Karl Marx saw it, a form of primitive accumulation. And an enclosure in England was the very kind of basis on which kind of Karl Marx's kind of model of the theory of primitive accumulation was based. But I'm going to kind of argue in what follows that enclosure wasn't always enacted by the rich. It was sometimes enacted by the very poorest members of society too, but just on a different scale, on a different level, on the margins rather than the centre. So accumulation by dispossession, by dispossessing other people of their rights of common, could be something that the poor involve themselves in as well. So what happens then if we retell the history of kind of England, starting with somewhere like Newent, or particularly starting from the commons of somewhere like Newent, somewhere this is somewhere like kind of Newent should be absolutely written into the enclosure story. For those of you who've kind of read work on enclosure before, you probably could have been banged over the head with stories about Northamptonshire and its kind of importance, but Newent should be up there too. It's an interesting place in the 18th and early 19th century. A place of mines, a place where there was an increasing demand for labour to work in the mines of the area. So we know that the kind of coal mining started in the Newent kind of field in 1716 after some kind of false dawns. We have some consistent kind of coal mining supported by kind of iron mining from round about kind of 1800. And it's got quite a large coal field as well, kind of extending from from Blowsden in the south. Is it Blowsden? I feel I might be mispronouncing it. Up to Dimmock in the Dimmock in the north, and these kind of coal mines operating really up until the 1860s. So the commons of Gorsley then provided a great kind of opportunity for all sorts of interesting forms of informal settlement by these low-level kind of acts of enclosure by the poor. Now, Gorsley Common, as I'm sure you know, straddles the Gloucestershire kind of Herefordshire border, and it's actually kind of an interesting kind of example, quite a rare example in the English West of an intercommon, a common shared by multiple parishes. And even more interesting, slightly obscure bit of information, it's an intercommon which was actually kind of divided up. There were different kind of areas of the common which were actually kind of allocated for the different parishes, which was really unusual for an intercommon. Very, very different, say, to the intercommons of Yorkshire and Lincolnshire. Now we know that on the Gloucestershire side of the border, on Gorsley Common, in 1624, supposedly there were 4 cottages. By 1775, so not long after the start of systematic kind of coal mining, there were 18 cottages, and by 1838, there was at least some 30 cottages. So that by, and this I'm quoting here from a very, very fine paper by kind of Herbert in the transaction of the Bristol District Archaeological Society from 2015. By the middle of the 19th century, several hundred acres of open land had given way to a landscape of orchards, pasture closes, and scattered cottages linked by a network of narrow green lanes. So we have a community forming, a community that quite quickly got a reputation as well. Now, it's a wonderfully obscure reference. So the life and labours of the Reverend John Hall, published in 1886, who was the first Baptist minister who set up the Baptist church on the Herefordshire side at Gorsley Common. So there was thought to be kind of a need to Christianise this kind of unruly community. And according to Hall, in the words of his biographer S.E. Shambrook, who's his appointee to work at the Baptist school in Horsley, up to a few years before 1831, it had been an open common, and as the name implies, was to a great extent covered with gorse. While in this condition, it had been a rendezvous for gypsies and other loose characters of all descriptions. By 1831, however, it had been to such a considerable degree enclosed that the term common ceased to be a correct description of it. A man would set his mind occupying a piece and would prepare material for fencing and putting up some sort of rough shanty to serve for his residents, who were then set to work to enclose and build in the speediest manner possible. Without church, without chapel, school, or any refining, civilizing, or Christianizing influencer, a strange word, isn't it? Whatever was steeped in ignorance and depravity to a fearful degree. Not in Gloucestershire, surely not. Over the border in Herefordshire. Their Sabbaths were spent in cockfighting, football. It's terrible stuff, really. An old-fashioned game called wickets. I'll tell that to the Australians. And in drunkenness and fighting. Meanwhile, in Gloucester on Monday night, many men and women lived together in an unmarried state. Horse stealing, sheep and pig stealing, and other offences of a like nature were a frequent occurrence. It was a sort of republic, living defiance of all law and order. The place was commonly denominated in the neighbouring towns, which I assume is Newent, and the villages, as Heathen's Heath. So this is a place apart, a place on the margin, a place that was not enclosed by Parliamentary Act, but these several hundred acres, 300 to 400 acres of Gorsley Common, enclosed by these piecemeal acts of encroachment. And it was said by John Clarke in his general view of the agriculture of the county of Hereford, writing in the late 18th century, that a cottage with a few acres of enclosed land, encroached land, gives the occupier a right to turn stock to these common hills. That should be kind of a supposed right, a claimed right, rather than something which is kind of legally manifested. The profit of that stock is expected to supersede the necessity of labour in cultivating the few acres which he possesses. Should these hopes, however, not be realised, any method of providing for the demands of the day is preferred to the drudgery of labour. So these are poor, landless kind of individuals encroaching small plots of land, sometimes up to several acres, building their rudimentary kind of cottage, and throwing off the shackles of paid work. I shouldn't be too rude about my employer. I'm very grateful to have a job in this day and age. But my word, it doesn't sound like a bad idea to throw off the shackles of paid labour. I should say that I'm not being paid to be here tonight. So this is a joy. This is different to work. So these settlements are thought to be subversive, a little bit dangerous. A sort of republic, a place of depravity, and a place where you can get by outside of the strictures of agrarian capitalism, where you don't need to do paid work. You work for yourself. You make a living on your small plot of land. And this is interesting. We'll come back to this point in a moment, because the conclusion from that runs absolutely kind of counter to our kind of our received understandings of the development of English agrarian capitalism. So the approach to the projects I've been working on, and at this point as well, I should thank the Leverhulme Trust, who've kind of funded my kind of research here, has been based on the analysis of 300 manors in the counties of Derbyshire, Hampshire, my native Kent, Somerset, and North Yorkshire. Gloucestershire has not been a county I've been systematically kind of working on, but I've been dabbling around the edges, because Gloucestershire is just so very, very interesting. Having spent kind of a lot of time in the archives in Taunton and Bristol, I was just so tantalised. I couldn't help but come up to Gloucester to read a little bit more what was going on this side of Bristol. So this project has mainly been looking at manorial court papers. Now, for the modern period, manor courts are thought to be more or less moribund, not interesting at all. And for large parts of the country, that's absolutely true. A lot of manors have ceased to exist. But where there is remnant wasteland, and by kind of wasteland we include all existing commons, all forests, all roadside verges, and all greens, village greens, manor courts tended to live on, because there was some kind of value in the lord of the manor trying to regulate how those spaces were used. So I spent kind of a few years kind of now looking at things like this, kind of presentment papers to manor courts, and my eyesight is not too surprisingly declining. Also been looking at kind of stewards' papers, state stewards' papers, state papers too, and looking for kind of evidence of this, of encroachment, the illicit taking in of manorial waste. Now, encroachment is something which has largely been ignored for the modern period. There's lots of very, very good work, systematic kind of work on encroachment for the early modern period, so up to about kind of 1720, but very, very kind of little for the modern era. And my argument is that encroachments actually kind of create enclosures. So when we think about enclosure, we think about these kind of acts, these kind of oppressive kind of acts, whether supported by Parliament or by kind of acts of acts of agreement. But these are enclosures too. For even if you are poor and you are landless, if you are taking kind of land out of a common, out of a waste, you are depriving the other commoners, the other people who use that space, of their common rights. It is the very same act of dispossession that larger forms parliamentary supported forms and acts of enclosure by agreement were undertaking. Now, there's a very, very kind of long history to this, and I don't need to go into a great deal of detail here, but you can go back to the very, very first statute in English law, the Statute of Merton of 1236, and its primary concern is with encroachment. Not encroachment by manorial tenants, but actually by the lords of the manor themselves, them kind of encroaching kind of land of their manors, land that they might kind of in, not in a modern sense, but in a real sense that they kind of own, but by depriving kind of other tenants of the manor of their rights of common, they were actively kind of encroaching against the rights of their tenants. Kind of an interesting kind of legal nicety, but it was thought to be so important that it forms the very basis of the very first kind of legal statute on which our kind of on which our laws are based. And these kind of acts of kind of encroachment, of denying kind of the common rights of kind of others through kind of the illicit taking in of kind of manorial waste, are very, very kind of important, particularly in the early modern period. But as I said, for the modern period, after kind of 1720, there's a very nice PhD thesis on Herefordshire, and a very, very fine paper by Herbert on Hartpury. So it's just north of Gloucester, isn't it? It's a very, very fine paper indeed. And these encroachments are often kind of supported by squats. So you take in a block of land from the manorial waste, whether it's a common, a roadside verge, a piece of forest, a green, and maybe you throw up your rudimentary shack. Now, it just so happens that a lot of these kind of rudimentary shacks have been much kind of enhanced over the years, and some of the work I've been doing on the New Forest, trying to kind of trace these initial kind of squatters' shacks. Many of them have kind of million pound properties, resting on a fairly kind of dubious legal basis. But we wouldn't want to kind of question people's kind of right of title. If you want to kind of find a kind of a nice example of a quite well preserved mid 17th century kind of squatters kind of cottage, or the slightly kind of augmented, there's a great one at the Weald and Downland Museum at Singleton, north of Chichester in West Sussex, and also at the Blisthill. Yeah, the Blisthill kind of museum in North Shropshire, so it's a very good example there too. So interested in encroachment and squatting. There are lots of opportunities I've already kind of touched upon. So things like kind of remnant commons, places like Oldbury Nate in Thornbury Manor here, kind of mapped in 1830, 6 years before it's kind of it's enclosed by parliamentary kind of act. But in this kind of map, you can already see that the common is being nibbled away at the edges by encroachers. Individuals taking small plots of land, sometimes throwing up a kind of cottage, sometimes just kind of adding the land onto an earlier encroachment. Maybe in some cases, these are not even kind of poor individuals, but existing kind of landowners who are kind of adding to, they're augmenting their plots. But this is fairly kind of typical. It's kind of nibbling away at the edges. Lots of cases where you do see in commons encroachers quite brazenly just taking a big plot in the middle of a common too, which kind of says kind of quite a lot about how kind of laxly some kind of commons were governed. In the very same kind of manner of Thornbury, another example of kind of remnant greens, Fowlfield Green. So yeah, I think it's probably it's either now under the M5 or somewhere very close to the M5. But so this is going to be the street going through with kind of some kind of encroachment kind of on the edge of the street, and this kind of remnant kind of green, again kind of attracting some kind of building around the edge of it. Things like kind of greens become very, very kind of attractive for squatters. Roadside verges as well, as I've already mentioned, really kind of important opportunity for spatial opportunity for encroachment. Apologies for this map here because it's from my native Kent. The map you can see in grey the road, and then a very, very thin strip of land around the edge of the road, leading up to a farm. It's got an interesting case, this actually, because the land was kind of encroached by Sir John Honeywood, who was the local MP and kind of a major a major figure in the Kentish nobility. I had no qualms whatsoever about kind of encroaching the land from the manor. Only when he kind of died did his heirs have to go cap in hand to the manor and ask for this encroachment to be actually kind of legally kind of enrolled into the manor, so paying a small immersement, small fine, and then an annual fine to the manor as well. But to go back to kind of to our beloved Newent, we see that from 1824, the lovely kind of quote from a legal case there, that nothing has been done regarding the encroachments presented at the last court. Those encroached by the roads think they have a right to it. So it's just kind of a waste at the side of the road, a verge. No one's really kind of using it. But roadside verges are actually quite important spaces for commoners to graze their cattle on, or graze their pigs on. So they did have a value too. So encroachments against against roadside verges was something actually quite bitterly resisted. Forests provide a great opportunity for encroachment, and kind of major kind of settlements develop in particularly from the late 17th century through to the early 19th century in the two large remnant royal forests in England, the New Forest and of course the Forest of Dean, as well as Bell Hill, at Lidbrook. It's all kind of informal kind of encroachment with the building of squatters cottages, then creating kind of a community. Often these forest-bound squatters cottages and their encroachment have been quite highly romanticised. So by the early kind of 20th century, it's a wonderful kind of patriotic book by William Hazlehurst called Our Beautiful Homeland. This extraordinary almost kind of pastely kind of painting of a squatter's cottage in the New Forest, and here's our kind of romanticised kind of poacher coming back from his kind of labours in the forest, going back to his illicit squat and his illicit encroachment. I want to kind of put a bit of kind of order on this and give a bit more detail why this really matters. Why this is not just something about something which is about margins, but also perhaps should be of marginal interest to us. This is about making community, and Gloucestershire is a wonderful kind of example of how squatting on manorial commons, remnant commons, and roadside verges and greens and forests created kind of important settlements. So somewhere like kind of Chalford in Bisley, it's a squatter settlement. Simple as that. The edge of kind of Cranham Common, lots of evidence again of nibbling away at the edges, which kind of essentially kind of provides the morphology of the settlement in Cranham today. It's fairly kind of typical, really kind of a lot of kind of Vale of Gloucester, kind of Cotswoldian squatter settlements. Perhaps somewhat more kind of obscure, but it really shouldn't be obscure, is the example of Bedminster Down in South Bristol. So Bedminster Down kind of remained up until the early 20th century kind of part of Somerset. Most of kind of the central parts of Bedminster by then have been transferred to the city and county of Bristol. But Bedminster essentially kind of develops both as kind of a series of landlord-driven kind of commercial exploitation of kind of land to provide kind of workers' kind of houses for the emergent shipbuilding on the new cut in Bristol, and after kind of the building of Will's cigar and cigarette factory in Bristol as well to provide accommodation for them. But really, in the edges of kind of Bedminster, particularly somewhere like kind of Bedminster Down, it's the development of the mining industry that provides a massive kind of impetus to kind of encroach in the building of kind of squatters accommodation. So something like kind of the South Liberty Lane pit opens in 1748, and by the end of the 18th century, 18 pits were working in the parish of Bedminster alone, and we see kind of a rapid increase in the population of the place, not too surprisingly. So we know from the 1801 census that Bedminster has a population of about 3,000. By 1884, that rises to 78,000. So this is kind of a combination of kind of planned capitalist housing development and kind of informal illicit squatting on the manorial wastes of the manor of Bedminster. So there's a really important story to be told here about urban development too. And for those of you who have ever been to Royal Tunbridge Wells, again in Kent, Royal Tunbridge Wells essentially develops also as kind of a settlement around encroachment, around the common of Rust Hall on the border between kind of Kent and Sussex. There's an interesting story about urban development here too. So it's about the development of communities, and we see kind of in the Forest of Dean. This data is taken from the 5th volume of the Victoria County History of Gloucestershire. That the different walks of the Forest of Dean see kind of a massive kind of increase from the mid 18th century through to the early decades of the 19th century, the number of cottages that are there, and the number of kind of encroachments on the forest, but also kind of therefore kind of the number of people who are kind of living in the forest. So particularly somewhere like where is it? Yeah, Worcester Walk, massive kind of increase in the number of cottages, going from being somewhere which is very, 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 very kind of few people kind of living there. We know indeed by 1675 there's an attempt to clear all squats from the forest. This is going from a base of essentially nothing apart from the keepers of the forest who are living and working there, to being a place which is not thickly settled, but there are important pockets of settlement which become kind of the main kind of villages and hamlets of the Forest of Dean today. Now, there's another important part of this story too, and that's in this period where supposedly enclosure was leading to the demise of the English peasant. Peasants are actually making themselves. They are, through encroachment in these kind of marginal places, taking small plots of land, a few acres from the waste, throwing up kind of cottages as well, and as we saw in the example of kind of Rosley, actually kind of starting to lead kind of independent lives, maybe occasionally needing to turn to labour to support themselves, particularly kind of during the harvest when they could kind of attract good wages. But we've got lots of kind of evidence that through kind of these illicit forms of enclosure, the peasants are actually being created. They're making themselves. So somewhere like Shapwick Manor down on the edge of the Somerset levels, it's an example from 1748. Thomas Hawkins, who's presented, had been for some years past had ploughed up half an acre of ground, and that his widow shall have the same or rent for it the same time to come according to custom. So this isn't just someone kind of encroaching a small plot of land for livestock. That would be largely pointless. You could put them out onto the remnant kind of common anyway. But this is someone creating an encroachment for ploughing land. At nearby kind of Eddington, again on the edge of that's kind of near Bridgewater and Somerset. The wonderfully named widow Rudy Norris in 1794, according to a survey, had a cottage and 4 separate encroachments, so encroachments at different times, which totaled to 4 acres and 2 roods, so a smidge over 4 acres, which had not been granted by the manor, but were in the hands of the tenant who must decant. So she'd encroached this kind of land from the manor or kind of her deceased husband, and was actually renting it out. which is quite kind of interesting. William Class of Chewton Mendip. So yeah, this is the very large manor that covers a lot of the Mendip Hills in 1782, was presented to the manorial court for enclosing about 1 acre to add to his garden as far as the road leading from Emberow, that's on the road, yeah, outside of Priddy to Radstock, to Priddy. So kind of adding to kind of a small holding, kind of consolidating their means of being independent. Was a kind of a wonderful kind of example down on the edge of the Somerset levels of a place called Wag Common, which has been completely lost from history. I can't find any kind of reference to Wag Common at all in anything which has been written. But here we had Samuel Stuckley of Langport and George Tuxon of Somerton have enclosed both ends of Wag Common and erected 1 or more gates thereon. They give out speeches and theatre to impound every person's cattle that shall be put or depart from the common, even though it is well known that the inhabitants of Long Sutton, Pitney, Netherham, Weir, Langport, Mulchney, which surround the common, have since time immemorial stocked and eaten the grass there with their cattle. This being the case, you are now called upon to assert your right to the soil of the common, or at least to common pasture there for your tenants of Netherham Manor. So the lord of the manor here is being implored to assert your rights. Stop this encroachment happening. So we have the tenants of the manor writing to the lords of the manor saying, our rights of common are being infringed upon by these encroachers. These encroachers from of all places, Langport of Somerton. It would be good to get a land surveyor to measure and map the common. The lord of the manor answers this plea. We have a wonderful kind of survey of Wag Common, a wonderful kind of wavy shaped common. In 1790, 48 acres. The encroachments at either end already kind of taken out and lost. We can see lots of kind of individuals had kind of land which abutted onto this intercommon of Wags. This is 1790. 5 years later, 1795, not only have the ends of the common been taken in, but individuals are encroaching around the edges of it, using kind of the roads at the edge of the common. Now, some of these are kind of simply kind of individuals taking kind of plots of land, probably actually in most of these cases to kind of add to their land south or north of the common, but also in some cases landless individuals taking blocks of land and throwing up a cottage. So we've got an interesting mix here of both the poor acting as informal enclosers and the already kind of landed being greedy and adding to their kind of holdings by kind of taking a bit of land from the common. Now this all gets a little bit kind of out of hand, and by the late 18th century, the enclosure of King's Sedgemoor, the award that's kind of issued for the enclosure of that vast area of the levels, includes Wag Common. In the map which is kind of created of the common, it shows absolutely no encroachment whatsoever, despite the fact that by 1799, pretty much all of it had been nibbled up by encroachment. So I don't believe everything you see on maps. It's a blatant lie. It's denying that anything has happened there at all. And indeed, 2 years after the award for enclosure is made for Wag Common and the wider King Sedgemoor, we now have 8 cottages built on the common. So there's a really kind of interesting thing kind of happening here, which is written out of the history books. Informal acts of illicit enclosure by the poor and by the already kind of landed, acting to remake the landscape, acting to enclose quite significant kind of areas of land. And of course, in somewhere like the Dean, somewhere like kind of the forest of Dean, this has really quite serious kind of implications. So, according to the third report of the commissioners of His Majesty's Woods, Forest and Land Revenues, a whole series of very systematic surveys of Crown lands in the late 18th century. These are the first kind of large systematic kind of government-sponsored surveys of their own property. According to this report on the Dean, the persons who inhabit the cottages are chiefly poor labouring people who are induced to seek habitations in the forest for advantages of living rent-free and having the benefit of pasturage for a cow or a few sheep, and of keeping pigs in the woods. But many encroachments have been made by people of substance, so like at Wag. The greater number of the cottages are from the neighbouring parishes, but there are also a great many people from Wales, which of course isn't actually that far, but it sounds rather dramatic, from Wales of all places, and from various parts of England remote from the forest. They are detrimental to the forest by cutting wood for fuel and for building huts, making fences to patches which they enclose from the forest, by keeping pig, sheep in the forest all year, and by stealing timber. So getting by using the resources of the forest and their own wits and what little capital they have to invest in livestock to get by without wage labouring. So what we also have is not only the making of community, not only the poor making themselves as peasants in some cases, but also the poor making property. There's in lots of kind of examples here. What happens is either the encroachment or the squat is presented to the manorial court, and often what happens is that kind of a nominal kind of sum, the individual is fined, they are immersed, and they're enrolled into the manorial court and have to pay kind of a yearly quit rent. Often kind of really quite small sums of money. So in most cases, kind of individuals say, well, yes, absolutely. This now gives them leasehold title. In some cases, kind of copyhold title. It gives them a transferable, an alienable form of property that's making private property. And the archive is littered with cases. I just want to give you a few kind of examples. So at Combe St Nicholas in Somerset in 1811, William Wall, a gardener, was presented to the manorial court for erecting a house on the waste at Longley and selling the same to a person likely to become chargeable for the parish. So he's not just kind of encroaching, throwing up a squat and settling on himself. He's actually selling it, something which isn't even his kind of land to sell until this point at which he's kind of legally kind of enrolled into the manor of Combe St Nicholas. And the worst thing is he's selling it to someone who's likely to become chargeable to the parish. That's to say, if that person becomes kind of poor and destitute, they will be legally settled in that parish, and the parish will have to pay them poor relief. So there's quite a lot of surveillance over this kind of thing, particularly in Somerset, interestingly. Nearby Eddington, back to Eddington, 1794, Mrs. Appley was presented for a cottage and small farm of 4 acres, 17 perches, which she had not leased from the manor she'd encroached it, but was now in the occupation of William Veal, who must pay rent. So she'd encroached this land and was now renting it out. This is capitalism. Just kind of an illicit form. This is not going to be the large landowners engaging in kind of property sales or the leasing of land. This is quite often quite poor individuals. To move it on to perhaps the best example of kind of the emergence of a squatters community of all, Kingswood in South Gloucestershire, or North Bristol, as it's called nowadays. And here we have kind of in 1794, John Bryant, William Jay, Robert Long, who are coal miners, as well as James Bush, Robert Brown, Isaac Shipp, John White, Jacob White, William Britton, and Edward Taylor, who were not coal miners yet, but wanted to try and get in on the act, were presented for encroaching and enclosing part of the common waste. So the coal miners are, and this is quite typical, particularly of kind of the Derbyshire kind of coal fields, but it happens a bit in Gloucestershire and Somerset too. They are kind of encroaching to create themselves a small holding to support their kind of their income as coal miners. So they become kind of dual occupationists, kind of petty peasants and coal miners too. And these kind of places were often these small encroachments are then kind of used to build other properties, whether for the family or to build things like kind of pubs as well, typically to serve these kind of emergent communities. And these other kind of individuals who weren't really coal miners were supposedly kind of encroaching because they wanted to try and kind of tap into some of the seams. It was kind of a frenzy of speculation in the early 1790s in Kingswood. This also matters as well. I won't make many more points before we have some time for questions. There is kind of an interesting kind of triangulation here. So obviously, encroachment is in the interest of the encroachers. You would not do this if you were not out for some kind of form of self-interest. But encroachment might also be in the interest of manorial lords. If someone is kind of taking kind of land which is not earning you any kind of income, by kind of charging an amercement, a fine on entry, and by kind of charging kind of annual kind of quit rents, you are turning something which is not kind of a fiscal asset to something which is actually generating you money, hard cash. And in some manners, these kind of amounts of money from kind of encroachment become really very, very kind of serious indeed. So some of the parishes in the High Peak in Derbyshire, they're getting far more money, the manors, from encroachment rents than from the other manorial tenants. Encroachment might also be supported by other manorial tenants. So, for instance, someone else encroaching might facilitate your desire to encroach too. I want to kind of add a block of land to my existing holding. They've got away with it, so I'm going to do it too. You see lots of that. Encroachment in one place often acts as a spur to other encroachment. But it also provides critically kind of a labour force. Or kind of a provision of services, things like kind of blacksmiths or pubs, often kind of illicitly built in these plots. So if you've got kind of people coming in and illicitly kind of settling, erecting their squats, it provides people who might occasionally kind of come and work for you, particularly kind of during the harvest, or in kind of many examples I've given you, will come and work in the coal mines, or in somewhere like kind of the New Forest. The settlement of kind of East Boulder develops to provide kind of work in the shipyards at Bewley, and so there are lots of kind of examples of this. But encroachment could also be opposed by tenants. The other tenants of the manor might well think, why should I let you encroach on this land because you're infringing upon my common rights? So, for instance, Purton's Purlieu, an area kind of disafforested kind of land within the forest of the wider forest of Dean Lydney, but evidence in the archive from 1806 of a group of commoners, self-identified commoners, going about and pulling down encroachments, and in one case actually pulling down a cottage because they thought it was kind of impinging upon their right of common on that space. So Purton's Purlieu kind of remains remarkably kind of free of kind of settlement for a Forest of Dean common up until it was enclosed back to Parliament in 1864. At Painswick in 1835, it was reported that the encroachments which frequently being made upon the commons of Painswick Manor have engaged the attention of the commoners, as has been kind of related to the lord of the manor. Two meetings lately have been so held, and this group at Painswick had taken advice from an earlier group who are active at Minchinhampton against kind of encroachments on their vast common here. So at Painswick, a group is kind of set up by the tenants out with the initial kind of permission of the lord of the manor to try and kind of clamp down on acts of kind of illicit encroachment upon their commons. Eventually, it does get support of the lord of the manor, but at first not. And slightly kind of earlier on, apologies for the slightly poor print here. An advert from the Gloucester Journal, the 17th of June 1811. I have to thank Tom Wilkinson for this kind of reference. An association of the commoners at kind of Bisley formed an association protecting the rights of the commons at large and putting a stop to the daily encroachments making upon the same. And this kind of attempt to put down the encroachments at kind of Bisley by the commoners actually kind of led to reprisals. And one of the key antagonists in this association had their barn set on fire for their efforts. So there's a final point then as well about jurisdiction. This matters because jurisdiction and borders here matter. And we often see that it is kind of on the edge between kind of one area and another, where one set of rules apply and another set of rules apply, that encroachment happens. So for instance, here we have the, I should quickly come round. Apologies to those not in the room. I've disappeared out of shot and pointing to a thick red line which denotes the border of the Forest of Dean. So outside are kind of the private manors. The encroachment is happening on the Crown land, literally following the border of the Forest of Dean. This is from Atkinson's Geological Survey of 1845, or the Mineralogical Survey. And it's really, really kind of telling. So we get one jurisdiction jutting up against another. You often get this sort of kind of a illicit kind of encroachment going on because you are finding a greater opportunity to exist in the relatively more kind of laxly legislated and policed forest than you are in the agrarian kind of private communities, the other side of the border. So some points of kind of quick conclusion. I realize I've been going on for quite some time. This is kind of a very different story then, a different story of enclosure, a story about often quite narrow margins, about forgotten places, forgotten commons, greens, verges, remnant forest. A story about forms of enclosure before acts of official kind of parliamentary enclosure. And I would like to argue that these kind of marginal places and these kind of acts of illicit enclosure absolutely should be kind of part of our enclosure story. So it might be kind of marginal in terms of kind of numbers. The acreage of encroachments in the Forest of Dean by the middle of the 19th century, 4% at most, perhaps kind of slightly less. But it's a fundamental kind of challenge to the idea that enclosure was always about class robbery, about the rich taking from the poor. Yes, by and large it was, but my word, there's a different story, a more complex story about the poor making kind of opportunities for themselves and sometimes impinging upon the common rights of the rich. That's a pretty fundamental challenge. And it's also quite kind of hopeful as well. This isn't just about a story about people getting by in gaps in the grid in kind of industrializing England, but it's about actually kind of inverting the very logics of capitalism itself by kind of engaging in forms of kind of property making, but just not using the normal kind of strictures of the capitalist system. But it supports the emergence of agrarian capitalism. It creates property, just not by the individuals who are supposed to be creating property. It creates a labour force. It creates communities, and it's also a story which has extraordinary kind of parallels with kind of indigenous kind of communities throughout the world today who are kind of struggling to eke out an existence against forms of kind of enclosure, particularly kind of currently kind of in Southeast Asia and kind of Latin America and parts of sub-Saharan Africa, where kind of the impact of kind of Chinese capitalists having a really dramatic impact upon kind of enclosing once going to be a commonable lands. So it's got a hopeful story as well that has kind of important kind of resonances globally beyond Newent. But the telling of our history should start at Newent. Thank you.